The conversation that healed 40 years of father-son silence. What is the heaviest thing a man can carry? It's not grief, it's not regret, it's silence. The heavy, suffocating silence that fills the space between a father and a son. The kind of silence that is made of 1,000 things left unsaid, of misunderstandings hardened into facts, of a love that is felt but never, ever spoken. For George, that silence had a name, Michael, his son. For 40 years, their relationship had been a series of polite, carefully chosen words that acted as a fragile bridge over a vast canyon of what they couldn't say. How's work? The car needs an oil change. Looks like rain. They were experts in the language of the mundane, but they were strangers in the language of the heart. If you've ever sat across from someone you love, separated not by distance, but by a wall of unspoken history, if you've ever yearned to say the right thing, but the words just wouldn't come, then stay with me. Because this is the story of how one man, at 78 years old, decided he was done carrying the weight of silence. And the one conversation he finally had, a conversation that terrified him, didn't just heal his relationship with his son, it healed him. The fortress of a father's pride. George was a man of his generation, born in the shadow of the Great Depression, raised with the belief that a man's worth was measured by the sweat of his brow, the stability of his paycheck, and the stoic set of his jaw. Emotions were a luxury, a private matter to be dealt with quietly, if at all. He had provided for his family. He had put food on the table, a roof over their heads. In his mind, his actions were his love letters. He had done his job. His son, Michael, was from a different world, a world that spoke a different language, a language of feelings, of self-expression, of talking things out. Michael was an artist, a painter. He saw the world in shades of color and emotion that George, a retired accountant who saw the world in black and white, simply could not comprehend. The rift hadn't started with a single dramatic fight. It had been a slow, gradual drifting apart, a series of small hairline fractures that, over 40 years, had become a chasm. It started when Michael, as a teenager, announced he wanted to go to art school instead of studying business. George hadn't forbidden it. He was too practical for that. But his disapproval had been a cold, heavy presence in the room. "An artist," he'd said, the words clipped. "There's no security in that, son. It's a hard life." What Michael heard was, "You are a disappointment." What George meant was, "I am terrified for you. I don't want you to struggle the way I did." But neither of them said what they meant. And in that silence, the first brick of the wall was laid. Over the years, the wall grew higher. Michael would try to share his passion, showing his father a new painting. George, unsure of what to say, would offer practical, clumsy criticism. "The frame looks sturdy," he might say. "Or how much can you sell that for?" He was trying to connect in the only way he knew how, through the lens of practicality and provision. But each comment was another brick. Michael eventually stopped showing him his work. Their phone calls became a masterpiece of avoidance. 15 minutes of weather reports and sports scores. They never talked about Michael's struggles as a young artist, or George's loneliness after his wife Eleanor passed away. They talked around their lives, never about them. George loved his son, with an ache so deep it was a physical presence in his chest. He was fiercely proud of Michael's talent, of the beautiful world he created on canvas. He kept a small, framed photo of Michael on his nightstand. But the words, "I love you," or "I'm proud of you," felt like a foreign language in his mouth. They were locked away behind the fortress of his own upbringing, guarded by a lifetime of stoic masculinity. The breaking point, or rather, the cracking point, came on a Tuesday. George was cleaning out his late wife's closet, a task he'd been avoiding for 3 years. In the back, tucked away in a shoebox, he found a stack of letters. They were letters he had written to Eleanor from a business trip 40 years ago when Michael was just a teenager. He sat on the edge of the bed and read his own words, the words of a younger man. He wrote about his work, of course, but then he wrote about his son. Eleanor, one letter read, I saw a painting in a gallery window today, and it made me think of Michael. He has such a gift. I worry about him, I know, but it's only because I see how much light is in him, and I'm afraid the world will try to put it out. Tell him his old man is thinking of him. George put the letter down, his hands trembling. He had felt it. He had felt all of it, the pride, the love, the fear, but he had outsourced the telling of it to his wife. He had used her as his translator, his emotional ambassador, and now she was gone. The translator was gone, and all that was left was the silence. He looked at the photo on his nightstand. His son, a man now in his 50s, with graying temples and eyes that held a familiar sadness. George realized, with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating, that he was running out of time. The weight of 40 years of silence was suddenly too heavy to carry. He knew he had to have the conversation, the real one, even if he didn't know the words. The most terrifying 3 words. Preparing for that conversation felt like preparing for battle. For a week, George rehearsed sentences in his head, trying to find the perfect combination of words. Every version sounded stiff, unnatural, or worse, accusatory. Michael, we need to talk about our relationship. It sounded like a corporate memo. Son, I feel like we've drifted apart. It sounded like something from a daytime television show. He realized the problem wasn't that he didn't have the right words. The problem was that he was trying to build a bridge with logic when what the canyon needed was a leap of faith. He called Michael on a Saturday morning. Son, he said, his voice tighter than he wanted. I was wondering if you might come over for lunch. There's something I'd like to talk to you about. The hesitation in Michael's voice was palpable. A summons from his father usually meant something was wrong, a problem with the house, a health issue. Is everything okay, Dad? Everything's fine, George said, forcing a calmness he didn't feel. I just want to talk. When Michael arrived, the atmosphere in the house was thick with a familiar tension. George had made sandwiches, the same kind he'd eaten for lunch for 50 years, ham and Swiss on rye. They sat at the kitchen table, the tick-tack of the old clock filling the space between them. They talked about the traffic. They talked about the unseasonably warm weather. They talked about everything except the reason Michael was there. Finally, after pushing the crumbs of his sandwich around his plate, George took a deep breath. He looked not at his son, but at his own trembling hands on the table. Michael, he began, his voice raspy, I was cleaning out your mother's closet the other day. He paused, gathering his courage. I found some old letters I wrote to her. Michael waited, his expression guarded, wary. In those letters, George continued, his eyes still fixed on his hands, I talked about you. I wrote about how proud I was of your art, how I knew you had a special gift. I wrote about how much I loved you. He finally lifted his eyes and met his son's. Michael's face was a mask of confusion. The thing is, son, George said, and his voice cracked, the sound of a 40-year-old dam beginning to break. I realized I said all those things to her, but I never said them to you. I used her as a messenger, and that wasn't fair. It wasn't right. I hid behind her love because I was a coward. I didn't know how to say the words myself. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty. It was filled with the weight of his confession. Michael just stared at him, his own eyes beginning to well up. George took another shaky breath. This was the leap. I know I can't change the past, he said, his voice barely a whisper, but I need you to hear it from me now. I am so incredibly proud of the man you are, of the artist you are. And I love you, son. I have always, always loved you. 3 words. I love you. They were the most terrifying and the most liberating words he had ever spoken. Michael didn't speak for a long time. He simply let the tears he'd been holding back for decades fall freely down his face. He wasn't just crying for the words he was hearing now. He was crying for the boy who had needed to hear them so desperately. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I love you too, Dad," he said. I thought you were ashamed of me." "Never," George choked out. "Never ashamed. Just afraid. Afraid for you, and afraid of this, of feeling this." He gestured vaguely at his own heart. It wasn't a long conversation. It wasn't a dramatic rehashing of every past hurt. It didn't need to be. The confession and the response were enough. They had, for the first time, spoken the same language. The wall of silence, built brick by brick over 40 years, had been demolished by the simple, earth-shattering power of an honest admission. They sat at the kitchen table, two men, a father and a son, and wept for the years they had lost and for the time they still had left. The language of the heart. The change after that day was like the slow turning of a great ship. It wasn't immediate or dramatic, but it was profound and irreversible. Their phone calls, once a minefield of polite avoidance, became easier. They still talked about the weather, but now they also talked about Michael's new gallery show, and George would ask, "What color palette are you exploring now?" It was a clumsy question, but it was a genuine one. It was an attempt to enter his son's world. Michael, in turn, started asking about George's life. Not just "How are you feeling?" but "What did you do today? What did you think about?" He started seeing his father not as a stoic, impenetrable fortress, but as a man who had his own inner world, his own loneliness, his own regrets. One afternoon, Michael came over unannounced. He was carrying a large, wrapped canvas. "I made something for you," he said, his voice shy, like a teenager again. He unwrapped it. It was a painting of the view from George's kitchen window, but it was rendered in a way that was breathtaking. Michael had captured the golden light of the late afternoon, the deep green of the old oak tree, the familiar shape of the bird feeder. He had taken his father's ordinary, everyday view and shown him the beauty and the magic within it. He had translated his father's world into his own language. George was speechless. He ran his hand over the textured canvas, feeling the layers of paint. "It's beautiful, son," he said, his voice thick. "You saw all this." "You're the one who taught me to see," Michael replied softly. "You taught me to pay attention to the details." It was in that moment that George understood. All those years, he thought they were speaking different languages, but they had been speaking the same one all along, the language of dedication, of attention to detail, of showing love through action. George had done it with numbers and budgets. Michael did it with color and light. They had just never built a bridge between their two dialects. That painting now hangs in George's living room, a constant reminder of the conversation that changed everything. It's a reminder that it is never, ever too late. It's never too late to say the words that need to be said. It's never too late to tear down a wall, even one that has stood for a lifetime. The heaviest thing a person can carry is silence. But the most powerful thing a person can do is to finally, bravely put it down. Is there a silence in your life that has become too heavy to carry? A conversation you know you need to have? Maybe it's not with a son or a father. Maybe it's with a sister, a friend, a spouse. George's story teaches us that you don't need a perfect script. You just need a courageous heart. You just need to be willing to speak your truth, even if your voice shakes. The three most powerful words aren't just "I love you." Sometimes they are "I was wrong," or "I was afraid," or simply "help me understand." If this story made you think of someone, if it touched a silent place in your own heart, please share it with them. It might be the gentlest way to start a conversation you've been waiting years to have. And if you believe in the power of healing and second chances, no matter our age, I invite you to subscribe to Still Here. Join our community as we continue to explore the profound stories that shape the second half of our lives. Because you are still here, and your heart still knows the language of love. It's just waiting for you to speak it. Healing our relationships with others is one of life's greatest gifts. But what about the relationship we have with ourselves? After a lifetime of caring for everyone else, many of us forget who we are when the house is finally quiet. Join us next time for the inspiring story of a woman who, after her husband passed, didn't just survive. She discovered who she was meant to be all along.